You're listening to the Good Question Podcast with Richard Jacobs. Our goal is to make each of our guests exclaim, that's a good question. I don't know the answer. Because when that happens, it means you, the listener, may be inspired to learn more beyond the interview and to ask great questions yourself that lead to new insights. In this podcast, we cover historical and current anthropology, comparative religion, and history. Welcome, and let's get started.
Hello, this is Richard Jacobs. My guest today is John Mitchell. He's a professor of social anthropology at the Sussex Center for Migration Research. We're going to talk about what he calls the anthropology of religion. So welcome, John. Thank you for coming.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me and for giving me this opportunity to talk about something which is very, very close to my heart and to my work. Just a slight correction. I am loosely associated with the Migration Studies Unit, but my main base here at Sussex is in the Department of Anthropology.
So what's the difference between, let's say, biblical archaeology versus anthropological view of religion?
Okay, so that's quite a big question. The answer is quite a lot. I mean, the form of anthropology that I work with, which is social cultural anthropology, tends to work on the contemporary rather than the historical. So it's moving away from that kind of digging into the past and that sort of, I guess, what do you call it, Indiana Jones kind of stereotype of of anthropological work about, digging into the past and digging into the evolution of religion. My work and the work of my colleagues in the social and cultural anthropology of religion is very much looking at contemporary religious processes throughout the world, and really trying to understand different religious practices, different religious beliefs as they are enacted and lived through people's experience in the present.
Okay. What are some examples of anthropological situations that you've studied, and what was your goal with the study, and what was the outcome? One example maybe that sticks in your mind.
What example that sticks in my mind? Well, I mean, the main bit of research, I've been working for a long time, kind of since the 1990s, really, looking at political and religious processes in the island of Malta in the middle of the Mediterranean. I ended up working there through a variety of kind of coincidences, I guess, in my kind of early career, university career, and then into the PhD program, which I can talk about if you want. But my main interest there to start with was thinking about questions of politics and political identity. I worked there in the early 90s, and it was partly because I became interested in kind of interstitial places that were kind of culturally in between. Malta is slap bang in the middle of the Mediterranean, so between Europe and North Africa, the kind of Near East. Early 90s was at the time of the first Gulf Wars. Malta was emerging as a kind of non-aligned place which might have some potential to kind of probe these differences, these cultural differences that were starting to emerge. This was a time when people like Huntington was starting to write about the kind of clash of civilizations in relation to that relationship between kind of the West, however we configure that, and the kind of Near East, and thinking about that as a kind of irreconcilable type of difference. And it struck me that Malta, as a place which had influences from both sides, might be a place where you could kind of unpick and think through kind of some of the similarities of what was going on there. So I went to work there with that in mind and thinking about these questions of identity and political alignment. By the time I'd got there, Malta had started to put forward an application to join the European Union, but nevertheless maintained a kind of sense of difference. And I traced, and this was in my first book called Ambivalent Europeans, traced really a set of political debates around the future of Malta and where that was taking us. But it became very clear to me that actually political debates were also religious debates, that the whole kind of both the promise of European accession and the kind of perceived threat of European accession were couched in concerns about religion and concerns about traditional religious practices in Malta. Malta certainly was then, less so now, probably a kind of deeply Roman Catholic country. And part of the argument for going into Europe was that kind of Europe needed Malta as a kind of religious savior, if you like. But then on the other hand, there were concerns about the kind of erosive effects of Europeanization on traditional Maltese life. So the effects of...
What does that mean? What are the effects? Like, what are some things in traditional Maltese life that appear to have been changed?
Well, particularly people's orientation to the family, that was a big concern. That would entry into Europe lead to a breakdown of the traditional Maltese family? Would kind of Northern European moralities take over? Would there be, a rise in kind of extramarital sexual activity? Would Malta be forced to take on a divorce law, to take on an abortion law? All of these things which were kind of associated with Northern European modernity. So there was a concern with kind of questions of morality, but also questions of the effect that it might have on traditional religious practices, whether people would need to kind of move away from the kinds of ways in which they had traditionally been celebrating their religious lives, and would that become eroded? One of the things which I looked at in great detail was the phenomenon in Malta. It's a not uncommon practice in kind of Southern European, kind of Mediterranean Catholicism of saints' feasts, annual saints' feasts. So I worked very closely with people who were organizing these saints' feasts and thinking about these saints' feasts. And that was one of the things that people were worried was going to kind of disappear, to get eroded, that people would no longer be interested in the local, no longer be interested in their own saints' feasts, their own, celebrating their own religious identity in those contexts, if there were all these distractions coming from Europe.
Well, what were some of the clashes, though, in particular? What are some of the particular, maybe religious rites or things that were affected that they could no longer do, or, societally felt pressured not to do?
Well, in the event, not much of that actually happened in the end. Actually, religious festivals kind of continued to be practiced and so on. It did have an effect, though, on other areas of social life. So, for example, Malta did introduce and have a referendum around the divorce law in, I think, 2006, and introduced divorce for the first time. So that was a kind of erosive effect on traditional Catholic values within Maltese society. As I said, there was a great concern about the effects of kind of Northern European ideas, moralities, Europeanization, modernization, and so on. In the end, in fact, the kind of biggest influence, I think, probably on Maltese society came from the other end, which was that once Malta became part of the European Union, it became a place that was taking in large numbers of refugees, migrants from sub-Saharan Africa. So this became a kind of new kind of crisis, not necessarily a religious crisis, but certainly a kind of social crisis of, how to cope with, large numbers of, sub-Saharan African people, arriving on Maltese shores. And actually, again, in a kind of paradoxical way, in certain parts of Maltese society, this, again, retrenched Maltese values and Maltese religious values and actually strengthened them with the sense that actually, these people, these migrants, these refugees, should be looked after and should be looked after by church institutions. So pointing to...
Well, isn't it the government that's saying come in, but then they want the church to take care of these people?
Well, the government wasn't saying come in. The government was found this quite kind of problematic, and there were various moments where Malta felt kind of abandoned by the rest of Europe as what they perceived as kind of waves of migrants were coming. I mean, the government set up kind of holding institutions and kind of detention centres effectively. But what emerged in the church was a much more of an emphasis on kind of hospitality, on looking after people, on taking care of migrants' rights, of welcoming them as refugees, finding places for them to move on to within Europe, rather than simply, kind of sending them back, which tended to be more of the kind of attitude of the government itself.
So what, the timeline on when refugees come in, how soon they integrate, how soon they, engage in certain activities within the society to see that they're actually assimilated? Are there any metrics that is anyone keeping that tells you that, all right, it was successful or was not successful, this migration?
There will be metrics. I mean, generally it is, Malta has become a kind of holding place. I mean, this is the way that kind of migration operates within the European Union. Once a migrant comes to the European Union, there's the idea that they should be dealt with kind of in the place of arrival. Very often they're trying to go further north, so migrants will want to travel further up into Italy or up into France or up into Germany or the UK, but they get kind of held in Malta. So the idea of kind of assimilation isn't necessarily part of that kind of journey. That said, there are increasing examples of, African, and it's mostly male African migrants, marrying into Maltese families and becoming part of kind of multiracial couples, changing the dynamics of kind of family life in that country.
Does anyone monitor people that come into another country to see again how they assimilate, or they just come in, there's a bit of news about it, and then whatever happens later, good or bad repercussions, that may appear in the news, but no one really studies and shepherds people once they get to a country so they can actually be set up for success. Like, are there any new countries ever do that?
The countries
They let them in and say, good luck.
I mean, yes, people do. I mean, I think there's a differentiation in terms of dealing with different types of migrants. So refugees would be dealt with precisely in those terms. So there would be, institutions which are dedicated towards trying to integrate them, trying to assimilate them into the mainstream society. For less regular migrants, let's say we could call them illegal immigrants or whatever, it's obviously much more precarious. I mean, people are tracing and tracking the numbers that are coming, but quite often when people arrive, they'll go into a detention center. It may be an open center, it may be a closed center. And then they start to, send out feelers for doing various types of work. In Malta, it's fairly common for sub-Saharan African migrants to work in the construction trade, to work also in farming on the land.
That's what I noticed. Yeah. In the U.S., in this state, you'll have everyone that owns a nail salon that is Vietnamese.
Yeah.
In this state, everyone that owns a convenience store seems to be Arab. It seems people cluster in these industries. I don't think that comes from the government or anything like that. I think it just comes from like other people that have come before them, and they find these communities and they're like, okay, we can get you a job doing this, which is what everyone else is doing, and that's why they tend to cluster in these industries. That's my guess. What do you see?
Yeah, no, that's absolutely true, and it does tend to be a kind of serial process, so that people will have contacts in a particular industry that then get passed on to them, so that when they arrive, they'll be able to kind of slot into a particular position, whether it's in construction or in the kind of manual labor of one type or another. I mean, broadly speaking, that is thought of as kind of problematic by the government institutions, because it's kind of allowing migrants who aren't really supposed to be there to kind of stay on. But very often within those industries themselves, there's a sense that actually these are good workers, they work hard, and they're kind of saying that they're dispensable is a harsh way of putting it, but there is that kind of tendency to say, well, okay, I don't have so much of a responsibility for this worker because they're kind of irregularly, they're here illegally kind of anyway. So if they go, or if they turn out not to be as successful for me as I want them to, that there will be others who will come along. So it places those migrants in a pretty precarious kind of position as they're trying to kind of build forwards and build themselves into a new life.
So how does the religious side interplay? The people that are migrants, whether legal or illegal, refugees, when they come into a country and they have a certain faith that's different from the country they're going to, what happens? What is there friction, or where do they settle?
I think there can be friction. I mean, I think it depends on the particular context that you're talking about. I mean, very often migrant groups will have their own churches, they'll have their own sort of religious organizations, religious associations, religious kind of sets of ideas, and will kind of carry them with them. And there's a lot of anthropological work that is done precisely on that, the kind of ways in which, let's say, kind of indigenous religious kind of processes are carried kind of in migration. And there are various kind of case studies. When there are case studies of kind of voodoo in New York, forms of kind of African religion in various parts of South America, North America, but also in Europe, that anthropologists have worked on, looking at how the kind of maintaining of a particular religious outlook among a migrant group can give them a sense of identity, can give them a sense of collectivity, can help them out in their own perception of the ways in which their world is kind of developing. And you get with that, kind of transnational flows of religious ideas and religious experience, religious feeling.
Okay. What are some research questions that you're working on right now that you want to find the answer to? I've been just kind of asking you whatever, but I should have asked you. Tell me what you're working on heavily.
Okay. Currently, I'm working on a project called Pilgrimomics, which is a kind of clumsy portmanteau combination of pilgrimage and economics. And it's a project that I'm working on with a colleague here at Sussex, Raminder Kaur, and some postdoc researchers as well. And it's looking at pilgrimage across 5 different faith groups from the UK, and particularly from the city of Birmingham in the UK, which is a traditionally kind of industrial city that is quite culturally plural, quite multicultural, has representation from a number of different groups who have migrated into the city over the last 150 years or so. So from Irish to Jewish migrants to South Asian migrants, Caribbean migrants, and so on. And we're looking at the links between different faith groups, so Catholic, Hindu, Islamic, Jewish, and Sikh, and their pilgrimage journeys away from Birmingham and to prominent shrines elsewhere in the world. We're interested particularly in the kind of the economic dimension of pilgrimage, and that really is everything from how people are funding their trips to pilgrimage, how people are funding and providing money for shrines, be they in the UK or back in other parts of the world, be that the development of tourist agencies that are there in order to provide the kind of infrastructures for pilgrims, but also then the kind of infrastructures and side economies of pilgrimage sites themselves. So my part of the project is looking at Catholicism. I said I've worked previously in Malta on Catholicism, and I'm looking at migrants from Birmingham to shrines, one in Lourdes in France and one in Santiago de Compostela. The Lourdes side tends to be a place where Catholics go, and it's very, very much associated with kind of healing. So large numbers of what are described as kind of sick pilgrims will go each year, accompanied by, kind of able-bodied and so on. Not necessarily in the hope of getting a miraculous cure, although that is a kind of feature of the shrine. But more often than not, it's part of people's spiritual way of coming to terms with their condition and so on. The Santiago pilgrimage is slightly different. That tends to be one where people are kind of walking long distances to get there. It's much less oriented around the destination. It's much more about the journey. And whereas Lourdes you could describe it as being about kind of health and well-being, the Santiago pilgrimage is much more about kind of spirituality and well-being, and is part of that kind of well-being.
You know what would be really challenging for you or anybody physically? And I saw a documentary on Ethiopia, and they have like this church on the top of this mountain.
Yeah,
climb up there to go to church. It's dangerous as heck, it looks like. And then there's another one in a cave. There's like Lalibela, where you go down hundreds of feet into the ground. And, if you were to study pilgrimages in Ethiopia, it seems like even going to church for the day is a pilgrimage in itself, or a journey for a lot of these people. It's interesting.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely interesting. And that, that's not kind of uncommon. And part of the walking to Santiago is precisely kind of enacting the kind of difficulty or the challenges of finding your way to get there. So in that kind of context, what I'm interested in is the kinds of economic exchanges of kind of reciprocity and gift giving that you get along the way, along the walk. There was a film a few years ago called The Way, with Martin Sheen, which demonstrates this quite nicely. I think it's a guy who starts to walk on a pilgrimage to Santiago because his son had started to walk and had been killed. And it's the story of how he meets up with a kind of assortment of various different people who are motivated to do this walking for various different reasons. But they establish a relationship and establish relationships of exchange, relationships of reciprocity, relationships of gift giving kind of along the way. And people help them out, financially and otherwise. And so that's part of what we're kind of interested in, what I'm kind of interested in relation to that. But also the kinds of businesses that you get setting up along the way. Businesses that are helping out with, transporting people's luggage, their belongings from one place to the other so that people can walk without a backpack, cafes, hostels, etc. along the way. And that's a focus as well of the research in Lourdes. So looking at how a particular, relatively small town in the Pyrenees has developed into this kind of major kind of travel destination, pilgrimage travel destination over the years, and how that's led to development of a particular type.
Have you been able to go to Hajj? Are you out? And have you? Those are huge events, right? Millions.
I wouldn't be allowed to go on the Hajj, but one of our researchers, so we've got a research fellow who's working on Islamic pilgrimage. She went to Mecca, but as part of the Umrah rather than the Hajj. The Hajj has got very complicated to participate in, and actually very, very expensive over recent years. It used to be the case that, but in any case, the numbers are limited, and the numbers are limited by the Saudi government. It used to be the case that there were a range of different travel agencies who would organize the Hajj for you, but it's now been completely kind of nationalized by the Saudi government. And so there's a lottery to get onto it. It's very expensive and quite difficult. So she wasn't able to get on the Hajj.
How much is it, by the way? Do you know?
Well, she was talking about up to £20,000 sterling.
Wow. One person?
Yeah, for one person. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Wow.
Yes, no, I mean, quite substantial and quite a substantial investment. Obviously, within Islam, it is one of the pillars of Islam that everybody who can is supposed to go on the Hajj at least one time during their life. But that then becomes, at that scale, it becomes quite a substantial financial investment. I believe it's part of a kind of shift in Saudi kind of economic policy, trying to move away from a kind of an over-dependence on petrochemical to become a more tourism, travel, kind of heritage related. So it's part of a kind of post petrochemical kind of era for them and how they see themselves developing as a country.
So what have you found that's interesting about the economies that are around these pilgrimage sites?
Well, that they're vibrant, that they come and go. They include a range of kind of official and unofficial style of economies. That there are kind of white, black, and grey economies associated with pilgrimage, if you like. So that, there might be official payments to a shrine, but then around that, there are more unofficial economies which arise out of, either accommodation or souvenirs to a certain extent, quite often. So
what about if at a pilgrimage site, the beliefs of the local people are different from the people that come to the pilgrimage site? How have you seen that reconciled?
I would try to think about it.
I'm not sure where it would be, but, I don't know, but let's say there's a site, again, that's important to Catholics, but the people that live there are all, Muslim or they're secular. How do they just, for economic sake, do they say, all right, we'll support this pilgrimage and this whole community around it because of the economics?
I think that can happen. It's the case in relation to Sikhism. As I say, one of our researchers is looking at Sikh pilgrimage to Amritsar, but also another pilgrimage site, which is actually in Pakistan. Pakistan is obviously a Muslim majority country, but they have organized tours. And again, it's kind of set up and it's quite expensive, but you have to go and join one of these organized tours to this Sikh holy site, the Sikh pilgrimage site, which exists within Pakistan territory. So they've kind of set up an infrastructure to allow that happen, to journey into, I guess, what you might describe as kind of Muslim majority context. You also have the kind of the obverse of that in Lourdes, for example. There are a number of non-Catholic groups or non-Roman Catholic groups who go on pilgrimage to Lourdes. French Tamil community in particular go kind of once a year, and they have kind of made a connection with Lourdes and with the Virgin Mary at Lourdes, and will go, once a year in pilgrimage there. And they are tolerated, welcomed with relatively kind of open arms by the local Catholic populations. I wouldn't say wholly for economic reasons, but nevertheless, there must be an economic dimension to that. But it's also this sense of the shrine being for everybody and for anybody, and that people's journeys to Lourdes and through Lourdes are diverse and can be diverse, and it should have something to offer anybody who comes.
So what are some future things that you want to study about these pilgrimage sites, or about, like you said, the anthropology of religion? Okay,
so one of the things that I have been, I guess, kind of struck by, one of the things that I've developed throughout kind of my work in the anthropology of religion, is thinking about the extent to which religion, which is something we tend to associate with kind of texts and books and, the Bible or the Quran or what have you, is actually also deeply kind of emotional. It involves the senses, it involves the experiential, it involves the body. So this is one of the things, I'm actually planning next year to go on the Camino, to walk. I'll probably be walking for about a month, with people, to experience it myself, to get a sense of what that experiential, how religion operates at that kind of experiential level.
Well, are you doing that? Good for you.
I beg your pardon?
Is it good for you that you're doing that? That's great that you're getting out there and experiencing these things, and you could write a travel journal, and it'll be a ton of things for you to bring back from that experience.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that it's one of the ways, in some ways, it's one of the distinctive things about the anthropology of religion, that that it does tend to be kind of participatory in that kind of way, that anthropologists will tend to join in with the practices that they're observing.
When you go on that trip, are you going to have access to, maybe at night, like write about your journey? What if you do like a living travel log to people that know you and want to see what you're doing? You send out an email like every day or every week on what the journey has been like. People could follow along. It might be really cool for you to do that.
Yeah. That's part of my plan. The Pilgrimage project has got a website of its own with blogs on it. So that's my plan, is to kind of blog on a daily blog throughout that process, giving my observations and my kind of sense of how the experience of doing it kind of unfolds. And also, thinking through, other people's experience, the people that I'm meeting as well. That's one of the things which is, I think, crucial to where the anthropology of religion is kind of at the moment. It's trying to gain that understanding of other people's visions of the religious life, not just through talking to them, but also by acting, joining in, and getting a sense of how it works at an experiential level. It comes in part, again, going back to my work in Malta. I got very interested in statues. I've said that, one of the things that kind of characterizes Maltese religion, the Maltese religious world, is these saints' feasts. Each of those is oriented around a statue, and the most important part of the feast is always when the statue is taken out of the church and paraded around the village or the parish. As a kind of, in some ways, it's a kind of symbolic representation of the patronage of the saint, that the saint is looking after people. But it's also a deeply important kind of experiential event, and it's a moment when, in a way, the statue moves from being simply a kind of work of art or a kind of an artifact which is held in the church throughout the year, moves from that to becoming actually animated, to having a certain power in and of itself. So it's a time when people's prayers to the statue and prayers to the saint will be listened to more carefully by the saint. So there's an expectation that during the feast, when the statue is outside, it has more power. Your prayers to it have more power, and so on. So it kind of takes a step away from simply being a representation of the saint to actually being, in some senses, a kind of an instantiation, or a kind of bringing into the present of the saint themselves. So you get a sense of the kind of power or the grace of the saint kind of being in the world in and of itself. The American anthropologist Robert Orsi talks about a kind of similar process in relation to, he's talking about Latin American migrant Catholics in the US, and talks about artifacts, items like statues, but also, amulets, prayer cards, and so on. He talks about these as being media of presence, so media through which the presence of the saint, the presence of the holy figure who's being depicted, is actually in existence in the here and now. So it's not just a representation, not just symbolic, it actually has power. And that kind of sense of things being actually kind of in the world around you, and people's experience of that, and how people react and respond and engage at a kind of bodily and at an experiential level, I think is absolutely central to the way in which I see Catholicism working. But I think it's pretty central to the way in which religion works kind of as a whole, that it works through people engaging, through doing. Again, I think we tend to think religion, we tend to think books, we tend to think theology, ideas, but actually religion is a lot about doing as well. It's and doing kind of with the body in order to generate particular kinds of experience.
Okay, well, very good. When are you going to be going on the month-long walk? How long till that starts?
That'll be next June, I believe. Yeah.
A long time. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, very good, John. Where's the best place for people to keep tabs on your work and to find out what you're doing? Where can they go?
I guess the obvious place would be my website and my web profile at the University of Sussex. So if you just Google John Mitchell Sussex, you'll find that there. You'll find links to various publications and so on. There's also a link there to the Pilgrimomics website, which is another place to see the kind of the unfolding of this project on pilgrimage and economics that we're working on at the moment.
Excellent. Well, very good, John. Thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I really appreciate it.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks very much for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Good Question Podcast. Please email support@thegoodquestionpodcast.com if you have any referrals to great guests for us to interview. Visit thegoodquestionpodcast.com to hear more interviews. And please help us spread the word by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. iTunes, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you listen to this podcast.